Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Welcome back to a brand new edition of Social Confoes. It's episode 110, and today we're going to talk a little bit about a topic that I'm very interested in what this all entails. Diego, tell me about it.
Sean, look, before we go into that, it is clearly evening where we both are. You're outside again. I can see some lights in the background. Uh,
And yeah, I'm doing this for the people who listen to the rerun who might just put it up first thing in the morning as well. So I
yeah,
decided
but
instead of going good evening, good afternoon, good morning, I decided to go good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I was just trying something new.
no, that's perfectly fine. And just to paint the setting, it's dark outside where Jean-Luc's sitting. There's a nice light in the background. He's on a beautiful Caribbean island that I think I should visit again in the near future. It's been a while since I've been there. But yeah, the topic we're gonna have it about today is kind of a follow up to the conversation we had last week about reinventing yourself. And we kind of had some interesting takes during that conversation. Also, some comments came in about what we talked about, and people really appreciated that. So, for today, taking it a step further, when thinking about reinventing yourself, you need to go back to the basics, right? Uh, as you grow up, you learn things. You're being brought up in a certain household, in a certain culture, in a certain society. But then comes a time when you're learning, but then you start developing your brain, you start thinking for yourself. You develop these biases. Some you agree with, others you don't have to agree with. And then to a certain extent, you'll need to unlearn some things you've taken from the past, or you'll need to relearn in another framework. So that's why I thought this topic would be interesting: learning, unlearning, and relearning. What does it mean? How do you do it? And yeah, what's your take on it, Jean-Luc, having heard what I just explained?
So my take is as follows. We're gonna do a short interlude to it into it. And I'm not gonna do a full celebration, but I'm gonna quickly wish Diego a happy birthday. Buon feriari, tide. Buon
Right. Thank you, thank you.
feriari, tide. Buon feriari, buon feriari, buon feriari, tide.
Can you
Diego,
translate that for the people?
happy birthday to you
All
on
right.
this 110th episode of Social Confoes. And why did I decide to put it in to the show? Is because this is also something that when it comes definitely to relearning, birthdays, I think after New Year's resolutions are one of the things that we look most towards when we consider our focus on relearning. So to answer your question, yes, there are definitely different factors that play a role, but before we go into the definitions, I think the mind state, the place that you are at within your life plays an important role as well. Whether it's the context of, say, school, where there's a certain amount of learning that's mandatory, whether it's getting your first job, starting a business, whether it's the people that you hang around with, your parents, people that you look up to, they all play a massive role when it comes to learning, unlearning, and relearning. So to give it a little bit more of a framework, Diego, when you speak of learning, unlearning, and relearning, what are the significant differences between the three for you?
Well, the first thing I want to frame it as is you have learning as a concept and you have learning as a skill. So I think what we're being brought up with is very much learning as a concept, learning as in doing things from your toddler stage. You learn by actually doing things, by trial and error. But as you grow up, you go to school, you go to this very, I'd say, formalized and structurized way of, you know, getting new things. You learn the alphabet, you learn languages, you learn math. So these are like cognitive things to do. But then you have other aspects. So that's learning as a concept, as getting information in and using that into the world or into the society you're brought up in, into your environment. But the other aspect of what I want to bring up is learning as a skill. And I think the learning, unlearning, and relearning fits more into that category. Learning as a skill is, I think, something very much underrated or not being given enough attention to, because when it comes to learning as a skill, people often memorize, people often learn facts, people often learn equations, but they don't go so deep as to asking the deeper questions as to why, how, but also not how they take in that information, like how they process it information, because there's different learning styles. And I think one of the most important skills to be able to learn is the ability to learn. If you know how you learn best and how other people learn, I think that will unlock a different type of potential on how you process information and how you interpret things. So that's the two categories I would place learning in: learning as a concept and learning as a skill. And I think the learning as a skill part plays a vital role into the other two stages of unlearning and relearning as you grow up.
So okay, but now here's the interesting thing about learning. So basically, learning as a skill isn't dependent on age, right? There
No.
could be people that learn it at a very young age or develop the skill at a very young age. And basically, everybody kind of develops that skill in a certain way, right?
Yeah, basically everybody has that skill but doesn't develop it to a conscious or cognitive sense that, you know, they apply it to maximize their potential.
But at what age do you feel that it should be something you should consider? And would everybody in the world benefit from it as having it as a skill set?
I think everyone would benefit having it as a skill set. Definitely, I'd say that the ages of, you know, baby toddler stages, that's where you learn by trial and error. As a baby, you taste things, you touch things. But on a cognitive sense, I'd say till the ages of 15, 16, teenager, that's where you kind of uh, get a lot of input. But the most effective period would be, I'd say, between your 20s and your 30s would be the prime time, I feel. Also, having read certain articles, would be the prime time as your brain develops into, you know, fully functioning uh, ability to maximize that. And you can also start understanding your biases, because that plays a whole big role into how you perceive things, and that you don't fall into the trap of, you know, leaning too much towards your biases, and kind of learn how to evaluate things objectively and how to restructure it in a sensible manner.
Okay, I'm
And
quickly gonna
one
dissect it.
correction,
Yeah,
Mario, I'm not 40 yet. Okay, hold that.
I want to jump in because of the birthday celebrations. I want to jump into to something bigger. So it's one of the reasons, and I think this is a beautiful explanation by Danny. It's like, hey, this is where I'm at in life. Am I satisfied where I'm at a certain age? And one of the things, and I had this discussion today as well, is comparing yourself to your parents. And often when we compare ourselves to our parents, there's different variables. that you look at. And then one of the variables you're going to look at is it easier to learn in today's age than it was 2, 3 decades ago? And if it's easier to learn things now, is it harder to implement what you've learned in today's age compared to a couple of decades ago?
I would say I feel like it is easier to learn in this time. One, due to the amount of information available. Two, the amount of discourse there is, the amount of interconnectivity there is, the amount of exposure you have to cross-cultural information to different perspectives. So that stimulates the brain to, um, process that information into, like, if you think of it like a computer, like your brain processes so much information and has many more outputs compared to a decade ago or a few hundred years ago. There was less known, uh, but I won't take away the inventions, the theories that have developed over those decades through the brilliant minds. Like if you think of physics, Albert Einstein creating these formulas. Yes, these are fundamental formulas, but what they lacked was, one, the time horizon to be able to put all those theories into experimentation and practice, but also the tools necessary weren't there yet. So yes, now we're building upon what has been developed in the past, but that also accelerates uh, the findings we have nowadays. So if you look at the technological evolution, it's only in the past, 50, 60, the past 100 years, how fast that has accelerated, how fast we put someone on the moon. Yes, a few thousand years ago, people were already doing astrology, but they couldn't imagine putting someone on the moon there. So that accelerated learning. And if you come to, okay, now we're talking very high level, but if you come to the average individual, uh, the amount of stimuli they get of information, uh, I think as humans have evolved over time, some of that gets embedded into them. If you look at you have kids, for example. If you look at how you learned how to use your phone, a tablet, a touch screen, and the rate at which they learned how to do that, uh, it's that's proof right there on how fast uh, you can learn if the tools are made available as you
But
at
still,
a
that's a
younger age.
very specific skill set, right?
Yeah,
And I think this is a good comment as well. It's a lot easier, but the choices, there's too many
yeah.
choices. And this is something we struggle with.
That
And it
and that that's
also,
why
yeah.
I'm glad that Hedwig brought up that point, and that's why I think it is important to learn how to learn. Once you learn how to learn and can assess things critically and objectively, you can filter through those choices much easier. So yes, it has become easier to learn because there's so much choice, but that has a drawback, as in finding the needle in the haystack. But if you know a system for yourself on how to um, step by step go through that haystack to find that needle, that is the valuable skill of learning that I think we all can use.
Okay, so how do you avoid the, they have so many words for it, but
Biases,
yes. So how can you,
fallacies.
because the fallacies, because if you look at it from like taking the word learning and then doing your own research, for instance. Like if I would do my own research, I
Well,
would have a comparable findings to what you would have. Comparable, not the same. If I would develop a skill set of learning, how would you define the skill set of learning? Because from a research perspective, we might have a pretty similar final analysis when it comes to doing your own research, but it isn't necessarily the case that the findings would be the same as everybody else.
So
So,
how
what
would
does that
you?
matter? Or would you say like it's more important to develop the skill set of learning than to have a certain kind of system to which you learn?
On that note, when you mentioned research, how in what bucket or how do you contextualize research versus learning? Do you contextualize it in the as a supportive to learning?
I can make a statement that in 5 to 10 years time, teenagers will be saying, yes, but I'm learning through YouTube, for
Mm-hmm.
instance, or I'm learning through TikTok. It's a certain skill set. And at a certain point, especially when you look at it from an education perspective, we've already established that from an education perspective, we need to broaden the scope, like the system, the environment in which you're being learned now is it isn't always keeping up with the developments of technology, for
Mm.
instance. So, and we have talked about the concept of learning and the skill of learning. To what extent are schools, for instance, focusing on the concept of learning, and to what extent should they focus on the skill of learning?
I think there's too much weight on the general concept as in a traditional sense of learning, and then I frame it in the context of uh, basically the industrial revolution of learning how to work but not learning how to learn. So there should be more weight into learning how to learn as a skill, and I think that comes into play once you start usually the master's degree to PhD degree of education, and I think that's a bit too late.
Yeah, I was saying because here's another insight. Like research comes at a certain level of learning slash knowledge. So my biggest worry is, are you willing to make that statement that there is a certain amount of mandatory learning that's involved to get you to a certain point that you can develop your learning skill set? Is there a certain level that you have to achieve, and to what extent are we still able to design that learning process for the masses, like everybody in the world?
I do think there's a certain amount of fundamental things you should be exposed to learn, but I don't believe the model we have now, or just that one model, is applicable to the masses because there's too much variance. And yes, you can distill it to what are the commonalities that everyone has, but I do think there's too much variance. I think there should be different pools of learning how to learn, of pools of schools on how to educate. So Hedwig says it, learning is very individual. And I think what is important is to get the individual to that point that they understand what works for them and how they learn, how they process information, and going the next step further, how they can unlearn, because I do believe that unlearning is much harder than learning as well.
Okay, but then again, my question is who decides? Like every individual decides from themselves when they should unlearn, right? Is there
Uh,
is there is there let's start with that topic. What's the definition for unlearning in this situation?
so unlearning is basically, say gone you've learned about a certain concept, how you should talk to people, how to manage a business, for example, or how to uh, or you learned a certain language, and the language one might be a bit tricky. So, uh, might should not have brought up that example, but
It's okay. We'll let it slide. We'll let it
I might
slide.
dissect it if I have enough time to think that one through. But on learning, I would say is basically the ability to let go of your frameworks biases because they no longer serve you into what you're doing. Say you've learned how to build a house through bricks and wood and bricks, and you build a foundation through that. But as time develops, new models have been created. You have the prefab models, for example. You should be willing to let go of the old concept. All houses need to be built out of bricks, for instance, and be adaptable to the evolution of that framework. uh, Understanding the fundamentals is very important. But in anything, it is important to know when, to let go, to make room for a different skill or a better skill. Because sometimes the teachings of the past can kind of be an obstacle to learning something new, because uh, you learned it's bad to, you know, throw. Wait, I have a great example here. Beforehand, going through shopping, people always brought their own bags, right? And then they learned over time, the supermarkets have plastics and it's convenience. And now we're getting through that process again for the masses, that they kind of unlearn that because it has bad effects on the environment. So that's more on a external effect. So unlearning that habit, I would call it, or that expectation that there's gonna be you're gonna get a plastic bag at a supermarket, is difficult because people enjoy the convenience. So that's a simple example of how that can have an external effect. Coming back to the languages, for example, I'm happy I brought it up in a sense, right? If you learned how to learn Spanish, for example, and once you understand how languages work, how they uh, fit, how they're constructed, how to convey meaning, I think it's easier to go into a different language. I think Spanish, French, the Anglo-Saxon languages have similar structures, so it's easier to go from one to the other once you've you know unlearned certain biases. I may have gotten off track a bit, so can you still follow me?
Yeah, it's interesting, but the question is about unlearning. Is like, is it something that should be a gradual process, that is no longer needed by society? It's sometimes that we have gone a little bit too far. I feel like in certain instances in the current world that we live in, we have to unlearn a lot of things. Danny is joking about unlearning the SMS way
Oh
of
yeah,
texting,
that's a big
and
one. That is
so
the
so
easy
but
one.
but that's also something that where you're started saying like, hey, we won't either. So for me, that way of communicating has come across because you wanted to do some kind of code, like for instance, not be having your parents be able to understand. Like the one of the famous one is BRB. BRB is just quick of saying like, I'll be
I'll be
right
right
back.
back. Yeah.
It shortens it, it makes it easier. Is that something that you have to unlearn, or has it gone on to an extent that
So
it's becoming too mainstream and that it's being misused? I want to go
so
even a little bit. Go ahead for this one, and then we'll go
SMS,
deeper.
yeah. So
Yeah.
SMS language in texting and BRB, I do want to distinct them. SMS language was,
Okay, SMS language is also you had a certain amount of characters,
yeah,
so
a
you wanted
certain
to
amount
say
of
a
class
certain amount of things,
convey a message.
and one had to convey the message within this space. And there are tricks for that. It's like And that's also how much the platform supports it. For instance, Twitter went from 140 to 280 characters because of this. So there's different things to consider before you can say like, hey, this is something we should unlearn. And I actually want to go a step further, because
Mm.
one of the interesting topics that I've come across more and more recently is the idea of how the pyramids were built and the technology and the systems that were used for the pyramids to be built. And that process was unlearned as well. So do you feel that that's something that fits into
So
that category as well?
so that's more on a societal level, a time period level. So I don't know how they were built. Maybe you can shed some light on it. Were they unlearned or were they forgotten?
That's why I ask. So for me, it's very important to define like unlearning as, is it
I think
something, are we
unlearning
talking
is
as a skill set right now?
the way I see it, in my framing. Unlearning is a conscious act. It's a conscious act to let go of your biases, your frameworks, and make room to reassemble. I would say it's basically, uh, if you have Legos, there's a house there, you break it apart, and you should be able to use those same pieces and build something up again.
But do you consider getting rid of an addiction also unlearning?
Yeah, I think that's a fair thing to put into that category. Um, and addictions are very hard to kind of, get rid of. And that's where habits come into play. So that's a big one. I would say, like smoking for the smokers out there, or other types of addictions. Uh, it is very difficult to let that go, because it has become part of your identity. It has become part of your routine. So it has become part of your framework on how you go through the day. So removing that, or breaking it apart from the framework, letting that go, is the unlearning process.
Okay, so with addiction, it makes sense to unlearn, but why should we value unlearning more than we currently do?
I'd say other reasons would be, if you aren't open to unlearn it, you'll be less open to new perspectives, new experiences, new cultures, new behaviors. And if you're rigid in that framework, if you believe, as we've talked endlessly on this podcast, the for example, the financial system, if you believe this is how it's supposed to be, and you accept it as is, and you aren't open to change, you'll always be subject to that system, and you're not open to other systems and perspectives.
Okay, let's look at it from a positive side. But let's say, for instance, and I'm really playing devil's advocate here right
No,
now.
that's perfect.
One of the things that I was thinking immediately, like, is what if you unlearn a skill set that's actually more valuable than you think? That would be one.
How would you know it's more valuable than you think?
You will only figure out after you've
Yeah. So if you
unlearned
unlearn
it,
it, you can always relearn it.
or you never notice it,
Yeah.
or you never notice it, and you've unlearned it something valuable. And the second is, what if you just want a simple life, and your current ways of living meet the demand of you being happy?
Okay, define a simple life, and define, give me some more context on being happy and having this simple life, and
So
add some
there is a
context to where you are now. Yeah.
very very simple story of uh, a businessman meeting a fisherman.
Yeah, we all know
You
that one.
know,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
So,
yeah.
and
We all
giving
know that.
tips on like how you
On
can
growing the
catch
business.
more fish,
blah
how to
blah
sell
blah.
those fish,
Get
how
a
to
mega
earn more,
enterprise, and
get a
then you
big
can retire
enterprise
once you have
so
so
you
much
can
money.
retire and then you can sit down and fish. And the fisherman goes like, but that's exactly what I'm doing now.
Yeah.
So why do I have to go through the whole process of doing that while to do something that I'm currently already doing? And with that, there are a lot of societal things. One of my favorite uh, thesis is the Society of Spectacle by Guy Debord, where he basically explains the world that we live in now. We live in a society of spectacle, and that's basically built on all these automations, everything that's being done. There's kind of there is no end. Like there's always continuously, gradually a next step. It's like video games that used to have an ending, but now all of a sudden they don't have an ending. You can just go on and on. It doesn't stop. There's always a higher goal to be achieved. You can
Is
always
there
earn more.
always?
Basically, yes. There in
So
certain
I
and
want to push back on that. Is
yeah.
there always a higher goal to achieve for you, or is there
There's
something
always the possibility.
that's yeah, that's
There's
made
always a
available or
possi
kind
there.
of
There's always a
dangled in
next
front
step.
of people
There's always a next
to
step to
chase
be
it?
explored, and we've gotten so invested in finding new things, in finding better things, and going this step further, even to the point that people are completely disobeying societal norms and standards just to be the one that kind of breaks that barrier. And there are people in the world who kind of say, like, we don't necessarily want that.
Hmm. You want a simple life.
Yeah. And in those cases, you don't need to unlearn anything.
I would still disagree with that because the unlearning process you can stage in very much different layers, different, I'd say, areas of effect, different impacts. You have community-wide, maybe immediate environment, internally, habits like smoking, for example, is very personal. So I do still think the ability, even if you wish for a simple life, the ability to consciously unlearn something is a valuable skill. The ability to not want all these things, uh, as mainstream media has put it, going for that bigger goal, that's something you can unlearn. So I do still think it's a valuable skill, even if for someone that prefers a simple life.
Yeah. But that's kind of,
And it also adds, I'd
but you're
say,
not born with that. The
it
things
also
that you're
adds,
talking about on learning, you're not necessarily born with it.
but
So
you've
it
learned
is,
it, you've learned it as you grew up. And some of
or
them,
you haven't.
or you haven't, but
Yeah.
there are things that you will learn. Not all the things that come at you may be positives for you, because there's so much input from outside, so much context, so much situations that you can be in, that you interpret it into a certain way. If you've been into a fight at school, for example, you're not
Yeah,
supposed to
but
go
you're
and look
talking
at.
about society as we know it. I mean, I'm talking as society where people are still closed off from the rest of the world, closed off of Western civilization. Like they
Okay,
don't
then
necessarily need to
just for
unlearn.
example.
Yeah. So for me, it's like there. Do you consider situations where
Well,
people can have a very happy life with ever having to unlearn something?
no, I don't think it's black and white like that. If you're
Do
talking on a
you
societal level,
feel that
no,
unlearning can be over commercialized, for instance?
that it, okay, you're making a big step here from societies that are disconnected from the world and commercialization. So, can you bridge that gap?
So um, there's certain topics on the internet where people are being unlearned things. One example that's the easiest to make is being unlearned to talk and dress a group of people with ladies and gentlemen. right? There's a very big step there, saying like,
So
hey,
is that unlearning or programming?
so no, that's why I'm asking you
Yeah.
this question. This is exactly why I'm asking you a question. So if you're gonna
So
unlearn yourself from using certain adjectives or using certain words, and I'm trying to keep it simple as possible.
yeah,
Like, yeah, that's
disagree with those, but yeah,
yeah. No, it doesn't matter if you disagree with it. The question is whether or
yeah.
not we should take that into consideration as part of unlearning.
No, as I framed it beforehand, I see the unlearning skill as a conscious decision to do it. If you're being forced or incentivized to do it without you knowing, then it's programming.
And how do you know if somebody is unlearning and when do you know somebody is being programmed?
That's why I say it should be by you yourself. It should be a conscious decision of letting something go.
Okay.
It should be a cognitive decision. It shouldn't be are being led in by some incentive or by someone or by some context.
So the people in the world most needing to unlearn things are policymakers. Is that what you're stating?
I could agree with that.
Bringing that to relearning, from unlearning to relearning, how much of the relearning is uh, effect of unlearning processes, and how much is it just a need, a societal need, or a personal need in one's life to relearn something?
Can you repeat that slowly?
So
How
when we
much?
talk about relearning, how much of relearning is something that you've unlearned that you have to relearn, and how much of relearning is something that gradually comes across in life?
I don't think it's easily put on a scale like that. So when it comes to relearning, you as you've unlearned something, as you've broken a concept down, or as you have let something go, some components of that skill might be good, some component of that construction might be good. The key with relearning, I think, is it falls in line with learning, but you've broken it down to fundamental concepts. So this comes to the, as we've talked about, I think a few episodes ago that we had one-on-one, the idea of first principles. Once you've broken it down to constituent pieces, you can take the best of it and kind of restructure it into maybe a better foundation, a better habit. So that relearning process is something, as you've gone through the unlearning process, that you've critically been able to analyze, coming back to learning how to learn. As you relearn, you you've learned how to build these building blocks together and build a certain skill set, build a certain framework, build a certain house, for example. So in that context, I would say, relearning, unlearning, and learning, it's kind of um, it's something that goes together in that process as you've developed the skill to learn and build and use those pieces to build blocks.
To bring this to a little bit, before we bring it a little bit more practical,
Mhm.
you talk about the first principle a bit. Could you elaborate a little bit more on that and how it's connected to learning?
So, first principle, I'd say first principle thinking is basically, you have a concept, you have an idea, and you see a building or you see um, how the car drives, and you try to break that down into fundamental laws of nature, fundamental ways that uh, things work. So again, with the Lego block example, for example, you have different types of Lego blocks, right? and they can build. You can build an airplane with it. You can build a house with it. You need certain pieces to make certain shapes, and those blocks are your fundamental pieces. Once you understand that this shape can connect to that shape to have this certain functionality, if you bring the necessary Lego blocks together, you can build something entirely new with the same fundamental principles, with the same fundamental components. So first principles thinking is breaking things down to its fundamental pieces and then rearranging it to something new or something better. And as Danny said, like you have a Lego house, you can pick two Lego blocks and rebuild a better Lego house. Yeah, for example, or build something very different. Maybe you build an airplane or a boat with those same pieces because the same components still work in that different concept.
So to what extent? Because there's a little bit of a move and that happened in the last 20 years from uh, intelligence, like IQ, to emotional intelligence. Is creative intelligence already a thing, or is it something that will come up eventually?
I have no idea. I think these are labels that are placed by researchers, scientists to be able to kind of more
So
easily
yeah.
evaluate certain behaviors. So if creative intelligence comes into its own label, I won't be able to say. But intelligence as a collective, there are different parts of the brain that react to different things differently. How you talk with people, that's what they, or how you treat people, or how, if you can show empathy, that's what they put under emotional intelligence. So maybe there's a space for creative intelligence as its separate category, but again, with creative intelligence, with emotional intelligence even, and the traditional IQ intelligence, the more logical intelligence, uh, you could break that into fundamental principles as well. Let's take emotional intelligence, for example. If we're talking about empathy, the psychology of how people react to things, you would be able to break that down into fundamentals understanding. It's a more abstract than I would be able to visualize or paint a picture, but it should be uh, it is something you could break down into fundamental concepts like emotions. You have a certain amount of emotions that we use words to describe, and how they link to each other, and how events can affect certain emotions. If you understand that, you can, I won't be say predict, but you could put out options with a high probability of happening on how someone would react to a certain event.
Okay, fair enough. We're getting to the portion of the show where we want to have a little bit more fun with the topic. So, what's one thing you want to
Well,
learn? One thing
before
you
we
want?
go,
Yeah, I wanna dive straight in, but you want to go a little bit more,
no,
a
no,
little bit more in
I want
depth.
some of your thoughts because you've been asking the questions here on most of the things you've asked the question, like just a high level overview from learning, unlearning, and relearning. How do you see that relationship, and compare it to an individual level and more a societal level?
So let's start off from the societal level. I think learning somehow has become underrated. I feel that a lot of things are,
And is this learning as a concept as we defined it in the
yeah,
beginning, or
it's
learning
learning
as a
as a
skill?
concept.
Okay.
So learning as a concept has become crucially underrated, and especially understanding the difference between learning from a book, learning through observation, and learning through actual experience. Like understanding the difference between the three of those, how the experience is different as well. Often we think that if we would read something or observe it, it could be categorized as experience and going through it, which is often not the case.
Mm.
It's a completely different process. So from that part, I'm definitely worried. Uh, I'm actually kind of excited about the aspect of learning as a skill as people are gradually getting more connected to it. From a societal perspective, unlearning is something that I'm still struggling with. If you would ask me something that I wanted to unlearn, I'm not sure I'd be able to give a question or even something that people should unlearn. There's definitely things, but I think those are mainly generational things. And often what we don't understand is that people got to where they are with the knowledge that they have. So it's really hard to say to unlearn something because unlearning something doesn't give an immediate guarantee that it will be a success. And for relearning, I think that's something that I haven't thought and considered as much either.
Okay, so that's on a societal level and on a personal level.
On a personal level, I think unintentionally this is already going on, but it's really hard for me to look beyond habits and routines.
Mm. Okay, fair enough. And I see some comments. Political intelligence, coaching, and learning has better results, in my opinion. Interesting.
Yeah, I mean, and that's something that I fully agree with in the sense that we've always had the idea and the concept of learning, and I think that's where we had it wrong. The concept of learning is that there's a higher state and that person knows much more about the subject than others,
Hmm.
and that they are able to teach every different individual
So
with a
that
similar way. I
that's
think
also a framework. The concept of learning
that's
that someone
yes,
with more skills or experience always knows it better. It's something that has been learned or programmed over time, but that isn't always the case. So letting go of that idea can be sometimes confronting.
yes, and I had a big epiphany when I was a lecturer in the sense that I didn't like the system fully because the idea behind an educational system is that you should be able to ask questions that people have to respond to, and you have to grade them based on a model that's the same for everybody. So if I would have somebody that for whatever reason wrote down exactly what I had in my correction model, they should be given the most points, whether or not they understood what they actually wrote. And I think that's for me is the difficult part because I felt that I had to unlearn something there and change my
Mm.
perspectives on teaching and learning other stuff. And that really messed with my mind.
Yeah, I from my simple model based on my understanding or my perspective of learning, I would give someone who wrote down the answer exactly as written a zero.
Oh, well, no, I actually brought them to the exam committee some cases because it was a clear case
Of
of
cheating,
yeah. In
fraud.
some cases, I had situations where students wrote down the exact second line of Wikipedia,
Mm.
and the rest of the document was in a different writing style. I had situations where one student copied the exact work from another student, and of course, you notice it easily when the information that's being copied is incorrect. But now we get into a situation with AI, which somebody in the
I was
comments
about to
already
bring that
mentioned,
up.
and you're now asking me as a lecturer to figure out whether or not somebody used AI to cheat. instead of teaching the skill set of understanding how AI works and how to differentiate and make sure that you're not doing the same thing as everybody else is doing.
Yeah, that I was about to bring up that part of AI, and I think this transition phase, if you just look in the past 4 months, how the models have developed and have been released, uh, it's kind of crazy. Like the system can't keep up with the technology in that sense. So
I had the funniest conversations with
so
ChatGPT over the past weeks. To at a certain point, I feel I was having a conversation with a person until the bot prompted me that it's still AI bot.
So on that note, right? Because I watched an interview of Elon today. I forgot with whom it was again,
Yeah,
but it was on the topic of AI. So the AI models now, so Open AI is basically heavily influenced by Microsoft right now. They were open source, and now they've kind of brought their code private, more I'd say tailored. Google has their own thing, own models, and these AI are being trained, like if we're talking about the process of learning, unlearning, and relearning, trained with certain biases as well, based on, as you mentioned, you got the
like you
prompt
said,
from, hey, I'm an AI. Yeah.
framing as framing, pretty much framing as well.
So they're getting frameworks and biases, and you can get prompts of, you know like you said, I can't give an answer because, if you're looking for a piracy site, for example, because it's not ethical, etc. uh, Whereas Elon's comment was, then you get this degree of control again, and people just, following what the AI says without actually critically assessing that. So there's this balance of this openness that you should have, that with unbiased and unfiltered information. But then again, there's the issue on safety and um, risk of the future.
So, how much has the idea that Elon made the Twitter verification badge available for Western countries because it's not available in Suriname? How much has that played a role
In
in getting people to unlearn the importance of being verified or getting people to unlearn the status aspect of being verified?
That's an interesting point to bring up. I actually have not thought about that directly yet, but I have noticed as I was scrolling through Twitter, there's different types of verifications now, and if you hover over it, you can see it's, if you're affiliated to a certain company, if you're a nonprofit organization, if you're part of the government,
And Facebook
etc.
is basically the same process as well.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and normal users can just pay for that verification, so it doesn't go through some sort of vetting or, mass accreditation by people to get some sort of consensus, like, 95% uh, of people trust what the source is saying, for example, with a track record. So I do think it has shown some disruption in that sense. What Elon's doing. I think one of the funnier tweets that I saw was, um, they put verifications on a media. I think it was Canada, on a national media company, and it said, this company or this network is backed by the government, and then they came with a counter argument or an announcement like, it we back at less than 70%. So there should be less bias there. So he updated the verification to 69% backed by the government. Just out of so that was one of the funniest things I saw today. But that just goes to show, like, the biases that these media outlets have. You don't know.
But let's
So
scale it
that's
down. Let's bring it back to our personal situation. I would love to close off the show
yeah,
with
that's
one thing you want to learn, one thing you want to unlearn, and one thing you want to relearn.
I would say one thing I want to learn is hmm, difficult. I am still learning it, but fluently speaking Chinese is something I'd like to learn. I can't see I recognize characters now, but I can't have conversations like yes, yeah. So that's one thing I'd like to learn. Something I'd like to unlearn, um, and I guess I'm in the process of that now. Is not eating sweets or too much sweets. Basically, uh, the liquids I consume mostly consists of water, tea, occasional some cocoa now, but I I don't drink any carbonated drinks anymore. I would say with the sugar intake. So that and that's I guess has been a semi-conscious decision, or it has become more conscious over time as I kind of build the habit of working out, which I need to pick up again. So I need to relearn that to a certain degree because I've been slacking. That this comes with the habit of if you miss once, it's okay, but if you miss twice, it's the start of a new habit. So that's the things that immediately come to mind. How about yourself?
Uh, One thing I really want to learn is how to build a community that doesn't require me to ask them for money. That's really like, I mean, I could earn from it, but it shouldn't be the main reason why the community is there. I feel like all the communities, all the programs that are being put up are in first instance to create a certain amount of money to get financial independence. And it's a very hypocritical statement because in the end, these communities right now they're all about money. So I can even say like unlearning that. What I really want to unlearn are certain habits that I have, like sleeping in, for instance. Uh, what I want to relearn is also connected to that. I want to relearn how to breathe.
That's an interesting one. Over the course of the show, you had brought up breathing a few times and brought up different models, but elaborate and close us off with that. Like,
So
why do you want to
I'm
relearn how to breathe, and what's wrong with your
one of
breathing?
my biggest worries with me personally, and that's why a lot of people were like, "Hey, you should be worried about COVID because COVID is a disease that for people who are don't have the strongest lungs, it could be very dangerous." Uh, my lung capacity, either I have small lungs or I'm not fully using my lung capacity. When I was younger, I always compensated that by being very active in sports. When you're very active in sports, you have the situation where you don't feel like you're being confronted with your shortcomings from a breathing perspective. What I've noticed recently is that I've increasingly gotten it's gotten more difficult for me to consume both milk and dairy products. And I could also say like I have to relearn what healthy food is like. We had Doreen on the show, one as the first guest at Social Confoes, and she has a non-dairy diet, and so she's not vegan. She's not like using those. all meat or something, but she has a non-dairy diet in which she doesn't use eggs, she doesn't use milk, she does not use anything dairy. We had a discussion on cheese, for instance, because oh, cheese is great, right? And for me, I'm trying to figure out what's causing it. But chocolate is one of the things. Chocolate with milk in it is for me very hard to put it down because it's delicious. But I also feel the same situation and the impact that it has on my breathing and on my sinuses and all the systems in place in my body towards breathing, that's having a negative impact. So, yes, of course, exercising more is one of the things that I'm doing, but I still feel I have to relearn certain aspects. I have to relearn how my body works as I grow older. And even if I'm physical, I'm not able to do the same physical activities that I used to do in my 20s. So that's something for me really to consider. And at Danny, yes, it has to be something that I like doing. So, for instance, and the reason why I say I'm not going to do yoga is because the threshold is a little bit too high for me. Because there are other things that I would benefit more than yoga that I would rather do first than jump to yoga. So, to give a little bit of an example, and I'm going to close it off, is running on a treadmill. You will never get me to run on a treadmill because I rather run on an actual track. I rather run in my living room from one wall to the other than run on a treadmill.
You need to feel that displacement.
Yeah, I don't need a machine for that, for instance. So these are things that you're gonna start considering um, in my situation, where I do feel like I have to do a different approach. I have to relearn something, and this is one of the things that I really, because my biggest fear is having troubles breathing.
Okay, that's a good one. Same with cycle, says Jean Luc.
Yeah,
But yeah, I
plus
think
has the same with cycling because it's not the same as sitting on a bike at home and actually being on the street and really navigating through either the traffic or the road that you're using to cycle. It's not the same thing. Going up a hill is the same with running and cycling. Going up a hill is not as the same as putting the incline of the treadmill up. It's just not the same in any
you
way.
don't have the pull of gravity. But yeah, I think that's a good place to leave it at. This was another fun episode on some concept that some concept that are stuck in our minds. So happy to have had this one again. This episode, same with the previous episode on reinventing yourself, and the one with our last guest will be up on the website by the end of the month. I'm not sure if we're gonna have a guest next week, but Sean, look, how are we for next week?
We're gonna surprise people and they can check back in next week for a new episode of Social Confoes.
Awesome. With that being said, we're gonna sign off here. Thank you guys for tuning in. It's been a fun episode. Leave your suggestions and comments in the comment section if you want to see specific people or topics that we should talk about. And until next week, see you next time on Social Combos. Bye bye.
Bye bye. Sway sway.